Thank you so much for joining us today, and without further delay, I'd like to introduce our facilitator for today, Dr. Heather Palmer. Heather is the founder and president of Maximum Capacity, Inc., as well as the National Director of Cognitive Wellbeing for Amica Senior Lifestyles. She has more than 30 years of scientific and clinical experience in brain behavior relationships. After developing and implementing evidence-based research relating to cognitive rehabilitation, Heather now devotes her time to applying what is being learned through science to help all people improve the way they think, feel, and function. We are very excited to have her on board today, and with that being said, over to Heather.
Thank you. Hopefully everybody can hear me all right. If you're having any difficulties, just send a message through the chat function, please, to Vanitha. Other than that, I will just proceed as if everything is good. So we're starting off with, why is my brain so foggy? So just to set the tone for the conversation today, I want to establish what the objectives are. So we have some key objectives, which is to validate the existence of cancer-related brain fog. We'll then talk a little bit about some of the most common symptoms that people are experiencing and lead into what are some of the possible causes for that. And then the second half of the talk really will be a little bit more about identifying what some of those solutions are so that people can feel that they're better able to think, feel, and function their cognitive best. So the first thing is really to visually represent what it is we're talking about. So for many people living with cancer, their experience with cognitive change will be variable and change. Some people might feel like they're living in a fog. Others might feel like they just want to pull their hair out and they're not exactly sure why they're experiencing what they're experiencing, and they don't necessarily have the language to describe it to somebody else or to a healthcare professional. And this might be a more ongoing process. Others will often describe themselves as feeling like all of a sudden their brain feels like it's out of order. No problems in the morning, but more difficulties in the afternoon, or from day to day, having a great day cognitively and then a less good day, which can often yield or result in this yo-yoing, this up and down experience, or a more roller coaster experience. So hopefully, based on who's on the call today, some of these experiences might be what you have, and hopefully, the hopeful part is that the presentation is going to help address some of that, or at the very least, validate those changes you may be experiencing. The first step really would be to talk a little bit about what is cancer-related brain fog. So more often, it's referred to as chemo fog or chemo brain. Most certainly in the past, those have been the terms that have been used to refer to it. And it's typically a term that was coined by patients themselves or those living with cancer when they talk to their healthcare professionals. There's been a great tendency for them when they go in for regular checkups, as they may be talking about some of the physical changes they're experiencing, there's a tendency to say, but my brain's just not functioning the way it used to. I think I have a chemo brain or a chemo fog. We have a slight aversion to the term chemo brain or chemo fog because research has demonstrated that people who haven't had chemotherapy can still experience the cancer-related brain fog as a result of some aspect of their cancer journey. So what has happened in the past is people have felt as though their condition hasn't really been validated when they talk to their healthcare professionals. So typically if they say, I think I have this chemo brain or chemo fog, healthcare professionals haven't really known what to do or where to direct them, and more have patted them on the back and said, but that's okay because we're managing your cancer. So the concern with using terms like chemo brain and chemo fog is just as patients and survivors have felt alienated by healthcare professionals in the past, when we use those limiting terms, we might be alienating or not validating the experience of many cancer survivors who haven't had chemotherapy at all. So the preference is to call it brain fog, or more specifically, cancer-related brain fog. Not only because chemotherapy is not the only cause, but also cancer is not the only cause of brain fog. There are many other kinds of brain fog that people are prone to. Just simply put, age-related brain fog. As we get older, our brain just doesn't function as well as it used to. Not to mention others might have stress-related brain fog, fatigue-related brain fog, pain-related brain fog, etc. So for the purposes of this talk, what we are specifically talking about is cancer-related brain fog. So the constellation of cognitive changes that can come about as a result of some aspect of the cancer experience or the cancer journey. Let's talk a little bit about what some of those common brain fog symptoms may be. So these are ones that have been identified through research and studies, but also are evidenced through the various discussions and conversations we've had with the thousands of people who have participated in the brain fog program. So for most, the symptom that they most frequently talk about is memory. However, for most people, the term memory is a pretty broad category, and it's hard to really understand deeply what specific aspects of memory or what are the specific concerns or challenges that somebody's having within the memory domain. So we have found that when people are talking about memory as being their primary challenge, more often they're referring to what we would refer to as verbal skills change. So challenges in particular aspects of memory that relate to your verbal skills. So examples of this, and feel free to identify yourself with any of these symptoms as we go through the symptoms. So examples of verbal skills changes may be something like having difficulty coming up with a word or a name, whether it's the name of a person, a book, a movie, or a recent restaurant you've been to. And it might come to you a little bit later, but at the moment in time, you're having difficulty or greater difficulty than you feel you have in the past with coming up with those words. Other verbal skills that people may experience changes in may involve spelling. So some might notice that out of the blue and a little bit more frequently than before, they're having difficulty spelling particular words, even simple words. Out of the blue, it's just a challenge to do so. Others in the verbal skills domain might notice that when they're sending emails or writing letters to people, when they have an opportunity to reread them, either an important word or an entire sentence is missing, which has actually changed the context of the entire message that they're trying to deliver. Email is fortunate is because often we will get response right away. So you send the email off and somebody might reply back with a whole bunch of question marks, which makes you reread your own email and you realize, wow, I thought it, but I didn't actually write it. And then a final area of verbal skills change that I like to talk about is reading. So with many of the people living with cancer that we have worked with, they identify reading as being a significant change for them. So that might demonstrate itself in a couple of different ways. One might be the experience of reading your book at nighttime, and then when you put it down to go to sleep, then the next night when you pick it up, you might find yourself reading back multiple pages just to get the gist of what you're reading. Alternatively, others have also expressed the concerns around even reading shorter articles or less complex materials and the tendency to get to the bottom of that particular piece of work and having greater difficulty putting the conclusion into context of the entire article because something in the entire article just didn't get processed properly, so the article is not making sense itself. And that may then be demonstrating itself later in remembering that article when you're trying to share it with somebody. And I think the reading one is a really interesting one to finish with under verbal skills, because another known change that has been found with people living with cancer are changes in their attention and concentration. So the ability to maintain attention and concentration for prolonged periods of time or for more complex material can change for people living with cancer. And they can be subtle changes, but those subtle changes can still have a huge impact. And it's important to recognize that from a pure memory perspective, if there are barriers to getting the information in, then it's unreasonable to expect ourselves to get the information out again. So there are multiple different barriers to information getting processed and actually getting into our brain. Attention and concentration is just one of them. So the problem is we can be experts at faking attention and concentration. So quite often we can smile and nod our heads and say, yes, oh, of course, but we're not really paying attention to the information that's being delivered to us. And so as a result, it's as if it's bouncing off our forehead and going elsewhere. So I bring back the concept of reading. It's hard for me to determine if somebody's having difficulty with readings, for example, reading that book at night and picking it up the next night. Is that a function of memory, or is it possible that it's a function of attention and concentration and changes in that domain? Many people do their reading at nighttime, and oftentimes people will actually use reading as a mechanism to help them fall asleep. That would suggest to me that they're intentionally not paying as much attention to the material that they're reading at that point in time. So I would encourage you to think through these factors, because it would be unreasonable to expect yourself to remember information when you weren't really paying attention to it or giving it an honest effort to remember later. Probably one of the biggest areas of change that people will comment on is what we call executive functions or frontal lobe function. So those are areas that are dominated by our frontal lobes and typically differentiate us. The problem is most of the world doesn't walk around saying, oh, my executive functions aren't working today, or, I'd love to go out for lunch, but I'm having a frontal lobe problem. They're more likely to bucket the experience in the category of memory or just not feeling well. But I think it is important and worthwhile to explore what some of these executive function changes are that are quite common amongst those living with cancer, just so that you can focus a little bit more heavily on which ones may be happening to you and which ones, more importantly, are bothersome that you actually want to do something about. So if we break executive functions into a couple of categories, one would be mental calculations. So this is a frontal lobe function where we have a tendency to do calculations inside our head, such as calculating a tip in a restaurant, or knowing that today is Wednesday, March 11th, if I were to ask you, what will the date be next Friday, or what was it last Monday? Those kinds of mental calculations, if you try them, you might notice that you're having greater difficulty keeping it straight in your head to then do the leap of the calculation to come up with the response. Strategic processing is another area of change within the executive functions that people will often comment or note. And so strategic processing is referring to the ability to take in information and then act on it in a manner that's strategic or more sensible in terms of order. So it's remarkable to me how much we actually use strategic processing every day, all day. A very simple example of strategic processing might be getting dressed in the morning. So it's not normally the case that somebody would have to think very hard about the order that they're going to get dressed in, nor do people typically leave their house with their underwear on the outside of their pants. So this isn't something we were born with. It's a process that our brain has developed to be strategic in the way we do particular actions. And so for those living with cancer, while the strategic processing changes may not be that extreme, what changes they might notice might be more subtle in terms of how efficient their day is rolling out. So an example I often like to give might be related to doing a series of chores in the day. Let's say you had a bunch of items that you needed to do, such as go to the grocery store, go to the bank, go to the hairdressers, go to the dry cleaners. And the brain that's functioning in a highly strategic way will probably start to process that information in a way that makes the most sense, that's the best order to do that in. When there are subtle changes in strategic processing, you might become a little bit more dependent on what seems to be triggers in your environment, such as the order that those chores come in terms of your driving and the directions that you're going. So for example, you might jump in the car and off you go to the grocery store, and you realize, oh darn it, I haven't been to the bank yet, so I'll have to use my debit card. Then you go on to the dry cleaners and you think, oh darn it again, I still don't have the money, so I'll have to use my debit card. You go on to the hairdressers, eventually you go to the bank, and now you have a whole lot of cash that you've taken out that you don't need because you've just paid for everything. And meanwhile, you get home and your ice cream has melted. So that it can be subtle changes that actually impact efficiency or sensible orders of doing things. Another one that's not on the list there that I think is important to highlight is decision making. Oftentimes, those living with cancer will comment that they have greater difficulty making decisions. Sometimes it can be big, important decisions, and so they're getting bogged down in the pros and the cons and how to make that decision. And sometimes on those days that are more challenging days, they can be even simple decisions, such as standing in a grocery store aisle and trying to decide which toilet paper to buy. I think one of the bigger areas within the executive functions that people notice changes in are planning, organization, and multitasking. So planning and organizing might be simple aspects of planning and organizing, or more complicated ones that somebody has a good sense that it didn't used to be as overwhelming or as complicated as it was prior to cancer. So this might include something like hosting a dinner party, whether it's a small dinner party of multiple courses or a large dinner party of guests with multiple courses. A lot of people living with cancer comment that that just seems too overwhelming, not just from a fatigue perspective, but also from the organization and the planning perspective. Alternatively, other examples people have given us include packing. So to go somewhere, it seems to be more of a challenge to put together everything that you need, and there tends to be a greater tendency to perhaps forget something, or even planning and organizing trips. The complexities of the plane tickets and the hotels and the cars, and then the packing on top of that. And that does kind of lead a little bit into what are often described as changes in multitasking. So many of us multitask throughout our entire days. In fact, for most of us, that's how we successfully get a lot accomplished during a day. And what we hear and what the research is showing us is that the ability to successfully multitask might become compromised a little bit as a result of some aspect of the cancer journey. So for example, that concept of, juggling 8 balls in the air and then going to bed at night, and maybe you've completed 4 or 5 successfully, but perhaps a few you've forgotten about. Maybe the next morning you remember some of those and maybe you don't. So that concept of jumping from one thing to the next and then successfully coming back to complete the first thing sometimes becomes disrupted as a result of cancer. A simple example might be that tendency to throw a load of washing in the washing machine and then completely forget about it until several days later when you're looking for your favorite shirt. And it's interesting, the multitasking concept, because we think that a big part of successful multitasking comes from what we refer to as the mental pop-up. And it's really remarkable if you think about your brain's capacity to pop information into your mind when you need to. So out of the blue, you realize you have to walk the dog or charge your phone or take out the trash or start dinner or call somebody back or get ready to go to an appointment or find your shirt. All of these things are regularly popping into our minds, and then we are acting on them or choosing not to act on them. And what seems to be happening when people experience brain-related changes for whatever reason, whether it's aging, cancer, or some other disease or injury process, is that it's as if that mental pop-up has become suppressed. So information isn't popping into mind as reliably as it should. It might not pop into mind at all. It might pop into mind too early, or it might pop into mind too late. And when you think deeply about it, our ability to successfully multitask actually depends quite heavily on information popping into mind to remind us to get back to what we were doing or finish something like turn off the stove that we have turned on. There are a couple of other symptoms that I do want to share, and I'm hoping by sharing all of these that rather than feeling sad about these experiences, there's a feeling of validation, and that if you are experiencing these particular challenges, I can certainly tell you that you are not alone. There are hundreds of thousands of people living with cancer are experiencing these particular changes. And the good news is there's stuff that we can do about it. So once we reach that stage of self-awareness and identify specifically what the challenges are that are bothersome to us, that launches us into a position to now look for those solutions. What can we actually do about them? So just a few more symptoms I quickly wanted to bring your attention to were motor function and coordination. And I like to bring this one up because most people don't think of this as being a brain-related change. Rather, they think of it as more of a functional or a physical change. However, many people living with cancer do describe some of their motor function and coordination changes, and they seem to be more related to brain changes. So, for example, having changes in your steadiness and your gait and your balance with walking, or fine motor skills like doing up buttons. Absolutely, some of this might be as a result of changes in sensitivity and neuropathy, but for others, it's not so much about that. It's actually a brain-related changes in terms of the motor cortex and how that's working. And then when we combine that with spatial skills, so spatial skills is your concept of where your body is relative to the space around you. So I can move my hands back and forth like this, and my spatial skills are intact such that I'm not likely to hit myself in my own face or hit a wall or the computer that's in front of me. And what we've noticed is a lot of those living with cancer will comment that they have weird bumps and bruises on their body that they can't really explain how they came about. And this may in fact be as a result of subtle changes in your concept of space around you. So a greater tendency to bump into a coffee table, or to stub your toe on the edge of the bed, or going through a doorway to misjudge that space and now you hit your shoulder against that particular door jamb. And then if you actually combine that with motor coordination, I might notice at the last minute I'm about to hit the edge of the doorway or bump into another person. So I try to self-correct, and in the process of self-correcting, I might lose my balance because my motor coordination for the self-correcting might be ever so slightly compromised. With putting these together as well, others may notice changes in their spatial skills with respect to driving. So you might notice greater difficulty parking. You may have been the perfect parker or the perfect parallel parker before, and now you're discovering that your concept of the space around you is a little bit off. And then the final area that I want to mention that's combining these two is that feeling of dropping things. So lots of people will comment that they find it's almost as if they have buttery fingers and they're dropping a lot more. And again, while absolutely that might have something to do with grip strength or sensitivity neuropathy, oftentimes it's a combination of spatial skills and motor coordination, brain-related changes. So you go to put something on a table and you've misjudged the space, so it's teetering off the edge, and then your motor skill to be able to catch it from falling might be ever so slightly compromised. And then last but certainly not least are changes in mood and psychological well-being. There's no question that for many, just from the point of diagnosis right through, there are going to be a lot of significant changes that will impact psychological well-being, and that will in turn impact how well somebody thinks, feels, and functions. So what are some of the possible causes? Generally speaking, finger pointing has always been to the chemotherapy. This is why it's been called chemo brain or chemo fog historically. And absolutely, some human research and animal literature does point to chemotherapy as being a contributor to cancer-related brain fog. But we know that there are many, many people who haven't ever had chemotherapy, or they haven't yet started chemotherapy, and yet they experience the same set of symptoms. So it's really upon us to look at, explore, and discuss other causes as well. One may in fact be the cancer. So for many people, unbeknownst to them, their body and their immune system has detected the cancer and is launching its attack. It's doing what it's supposed to do to really protect the body. And part of that attack is in fact an increased production in cytokines that can cause inflammation to the brain. So it's quite possible that some people are experiencing some of these cognitive challenges as a result of increased brain inflammation, which I assume is a mechanism to protect the brain, but inflammation can create some barriers in terms of function. I think it's also important to recognize that there are not that many who are living with cancer who are not taking additional drugs or have made additional changes in a metabolic way to their bodies. So many people, as a result of the cancer treatments themselves, may be taking additional medications to help better support those treatments, whether it's anti-nausea medication, anti-anxiety, sleep aids. For many, cancer can launch them into menopause. So there's a more possibly sudden increase in use of hormone replacement therapies or other medications to manage that. And then on top of all of that, generally speaking, people start to do their own internet searches and they start to make other ingestible changes. So there might be a tendency to lean towards herbal and naturopathic remedies, or there might be changes in diet, so more quinoa instead of rice and lots of green teas. And while all of these things are designed to be good and to help, the truth is we don't know how our body metabolizes those combinations. So there is a possibility that some of the combinations that we're choosing and these additional cancer-related medicines that we might be taking to manage cancer treatments themselves may be exacerbating how we think. And then finally, there's the genetic predisposition. You know, it's inevitable that some of us are probably just genetically predisposed to have more cognitive challenges when we are faced with other physical challenges. And in order to explore this, they are in fact looking at, a disease process like Alzheimer's disease, where there is a small percentage of the population who might have a genetic link, so a specific gene mutation, and they're following those people with that gene mutation over time. And what they have determined is if somebody with that particular gene mutation does go on to develop cancer, they seem to be at greater risk for some of the cognitive challenges. Their cancer-related brain fog might be a little bit more apparent, a little bit more severe, or come on a little bit earlier. And then, of course, there's the psychosocial construct. So not only do we talk about psychological well-being as a symptom, but it is also a cause of cancer-related brain fog. Because as I said earlier, when we don't feel great, we simply just don't think as well. And so there's lots of knowledge limitations. Definitely this research area would be described or defined as being in its infancy. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. Probably one of the most important reasons is that the professional responsibility is not clear. Cancer-related brain fog doesn't clearly fall into one particular professional domain over another. So is it your oncologist who should be supporting you through this, or your family doctor, or your occupational therapist, or a psychologist? It's not a category that says this is who's responsible for it. And as a result of that, there tends to be a little bit of a gray area of who supports it and how they support it, the amount of funds that are going into supporting it, the amount of funds that are going into researching it, and then also the assessment measures. So typically speaking, if somebody were to go and see their doctor and request to be assessed for their cognitive capacity and the changes they're experiencing, quite often some of those standardized tools are really not tapping into the specific high-level functional changes that those living with cancer are experiencing. And even though the tests aren't tapping into it or detecting it, it doesn't mean that sometimes these smaller changes that aren't detectable aren't still having a huge impact on someone's life. So what do we know? Well, first, we know that cancer-related brain fog is defined as being one of the top 3 concerns identified by cancer patients worldwide. So in a whole series of different studies done in different countries at different points in time, when those living with cancer are asked what are their primary concerns, cancer-related brain fog stands up as being one of the top 3, the other 2 being fatigue and fear of recurrence. We certainly know that the symptoms are variable. They vary from person to person, and the severity and the duration of cancer-related brain fog is going to also vary from person to person. It would appear that most assessment tools don't accurately or adequately detect it, and even subtle changes do have a big impact on people's quality of life. But the good news is through some of the research, it has been identified that there are neurophysiological changes that can occur in those who have cancer and have been treated for cancer. And therefore, as a result of that, there's a little bit more evidence and direction towards understanding specifically the brain processes that may be affected, and more specifically, what can we do about it? So I like sharing this particular slide because I think it's a wonderful example of some of the challenges in this particular area of research right now, but also it helps to clarify for a lot of people living with cancer some of the extreme fatigue they have. So I'm just going to devote a few minutes to describing this particular study in a little bit more detail. So what you're looking at is this is actually a study that was done only with 2 patients. They were monozygotic or identical twins. Twin A had cancer and was treated for it, and twin B did not. Twin A expressed on a regular basis to her healthcare professionals that she was concerned about how her brain was changing, that she wasn't thinking as well as she used to prior to her cancer diagnosis. So both twins had the opportunity to do a full battery of neuropsychological tests. And when I say a full battery, that would be looking at memory and language and multitasking, all the things we've been talking about, and it can often take 2-3 days to do a complex neuropsych battery. And when those were done, the general results were that twin A was performing well within normal range for her age and education levels, and her performance, her scores did not significantly differ to her twin who had not had cancer. So they were stopped. So the next opportunity was to go into what's called an fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance image machine. So one at a time, the twin would go into this machine like an MRI. And while they're in the machine, they are doing a task, and the researchers are looking at blood flow through the brain while they do the activity. So it's a window of opportunity to really look at the inside of somebody's functioning brain while they're doing something. So in this particular exercise, they were doing a working memory task, which is our everyday in-out memory process. We take information in, we hold it for a little bit, and then we spit it out, and then we take more information in. And there are multiple different layers of that particular task. It gets more and more complex. So what you have in front of you is you have twin A, the one who had been diagnosed and treated with cancer, across the top horizontally, and twin B horizontally across the bottom. And then vertically, what you're seeing is the differences in their brains in terms of the cerebral blood flow. When the task is in the first column, it's easy task, then it gets a little bit more difficult, and then it gets increasingly more difficult. And there are not a whole lot of significant changes in front of what you see. The most significant change is in that column 1. So when the task is relatively simple and they're both performing the tasks just as well as one another, when there's the window of opportunity to look inside the brain, you can see that twin A has a lot more activity, a lot more cerebral blood flow to perform that simple task just as well as her counterpart, her fellow twin. As the tasks get more difficult, there aren't, so for column 2 and column 3, there are not significant differences between them. So in essence, when the task is super simple, it's as if twin A has to get revved up to the point that she needs to be to do it when it's super difficult, but she needs to get her brain revved up to that level for a simple task. Where somebody who hasn't had cancer or been treated for it doesn't have to when it's simple. They only really have to get revved up as it gets more and more difficult. And I think this is really important to have shared with you for a couple reasons. One, it demonstrates that quite often our pen and paper neuropsychological tests aren't detecting what's going on. Because again, twin A did just as well as twin B. So on paper, her performance was just as strong. But when there's opportunity to look at the brain, you can see that, wow, what her brain is going through to be able to reach that level of success and accomplishment is a lot more activity in the simplest form than her twin. I think the second really important message for those living with cancer is I think this helps to explain some of the extreme fatigue. It would not be surprising to me if doing even a relatively simple day of simple tasks, if your brain is requiring this level of activation to get through simple tasks in simple days, it's not surprising that you might feel that mental and physical fatigue at the end of the day, which of course is now going to have a domino effect in terms of how well you function. So what are the solutions? So it's important to understand that first and foremost, cancer-related brain fog does exist, but more specifically to try and understand what are the specific challenges you might be facing. Absolutely, we'd love to be able to prevent it, and I can assure you research is underway to better understand the condition, so prevention might come into play. And then there's the treating it part. So if we can't prevent it, and it's a condition that still exists, then how can we treat it? At this point in time, there are no pharmacological remedies for cancer-related brain fog. There are doctors and there are researchers who are exploring different medications or medication combinations to see if they can enhance somebody's cognitive challenges when they're facing cancer-related brain fog, but there isn't anything that's currently widely available or accepted to say if you have cancer-related brain fog, take 2 pills in the morning and you'll be fine. So really what that leaves us with is that leaves us with cognitive rehabilitation. So what can we be proactively doing right now to address the challenges that we're facing as individuals to help us to improve and function our best? So cognitive rehabilitation and the approaches that we use are founded in theories of neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity being that understanding and that belief that the brain does have the power to build new pathways and new connections or neural networks between brain regions. So instead of focusing on the brain and giving a long, boring brain lecture on how the brain works and the different lobes and what the different bobs do, I'm strongly encouraging you to think about your brain from a neuroplastic. And imagine your brain as having a whole series of superhighways where information is going back and forth at rapid speed. And for some reason, as a result of some aspect of your cancer or your treatment, these highway systems have developed cracks and potholes. And so information can't go as smoothly as it used to. This is a function of normal aging as well. As we get older, our pathway systems do not process information as fast or as easily as it used to. So it's not surprising that if people are experiencing other changes in their brain as a result of a disease or an injury process, that this might be what's happening. There's a general slowness. So the good news is because the brain has the capacity to repair and grow, there are 3 different areas that the brain fog program focuses on to help people to get their thinking back on track. One is the concept of using strategies and techniques to repair existing pathways. I love it when I hear people say, oh, I used to always do that, but I don't anymore, because that tells me that there is the foundation of a pathway there. And we just need to figure out why aren't they using it? Do we need to help to repair that pathway? Has that pathway been damaged in some way? So by way of example, every time you use a strategy, let's say it's just to remember someone's name. My name is Heather. Maybe you don't think you need to remember that later, which is fine. But if you took the effort to think, Heather, she reminds me of my niece Heather or my friend Heather, or she's as sunny as the weather, some extra level of processing, what you're doing is you're throwing a layer of pavement on that pathway. And so every time you use a strategy, you're throwing more and more pavement on a pathway. And by doing so, you're filling in those cracks and potholes and creating a smooth surface. Sometimes, however, pathways may be beyond repair, or it might be too much effort to fix an existing pathway. So sticking with the highway analogy, that may very well be the case in terms of whether there's been brain injury specifically or a brain disease going on. But this too can happen for some people with cancer-related brain fog, is that no matter what strategy or technique they use, they're having difficulty repairing existing pathways. So instead, building new pathways. So that's really the concept of learning a new way of doing something or learning a new skill, and then practicing and practicing and practicing it. So each time you practice it, you're building and building and building that pathway to become a smooth running surface. And then finally, people will often say, well, why could I do it yesterday and I can't do it today? Or why do I wake up in the middle of the night and it pops into my head? And if we stick with the highway analogy, I really strongly encourage you to recognize that your brain is also going to be subject to rush hour and roadblocks. So just as you would not expect to get from A to B in the morning during rush hour in the same amount of time as when it's not rush hour, I think it's really worthwhile to evaluate for yourself, when is rush hour in your brain? When are your more alert times versus your more fatigued times? And how can you shape your day around maximizing that? So how can you plan and prepare and recognize, you know what, I used to be a morning person, but I'm not anymore. I still feel really foggy in the morning. So instead of doing my taxes in the morning, I'm going to fold laundry. And when I'm feeling bright and bushy-eyed and alert, that's when I'm going to do my more cognitively demanding tasks. So the more we can launch ourselves into that self-awareness piece, identify the challenges we're having that are bothersome to us, and then start to plan our days and the strategies and the techniques that we need, the more likely we're going to see significant cognitive improvement. So our particular brain fog program focuses on three main areas. So this is a program that is evidence-based, and we've studied it in a few populations, and it's been running quite actively for cancer survivors in Canada and the US for more than 10 years now. And so the three components that we focus on primarily are memory, task management, and psychological well-being. And combined, we believe that these three components can really help somebody to optimize or maximize their cognitive status. So I'm just going to give you a brief intro to what the focus is in each of these particular sections. So if we think about memory, and we've talked a little bit about memory and how it's a big, broad term, generally speaking, the changes or challenges people will have in memory, while they might be in a verbal domain, it's actually more related to how information is getting processed. So how are we getting information into our brain? I'd mentioned attention and concentration as being barriers. Other barriers are fatigue, pain, worry. When any of those conditions are present, we simply are not going to pull information into our brain as readily or as easily as we used to, which is then going to compromise the ability to pull it out when we need to. And I like to share this particular research project because it's such a simple project that demonstrates how a tiny little bit of extra effort can help you to process the information in a deeper way. So in this particular study, there were three groups of university students, presumably all cognitively intact university students, and all three were given the exact same exercise to do, except there was one small change in the instructions. So the first group was told, I'm going to read a list of words to you and I want you to do your best to remember them, because I will test you for them later. However, when I read the words to you, I want you to focus on the first letter of each word. So for example, bat starts with B, hall starts with H. The second group was given the same list of words and the same instruction, except their change in the instruction was, when I read the words to you, I want you to come up with a rhyme for each word. So if I say bat, you might think cat. If I say hall, you might think mall. And then the third group was given the same list of words and the same instructions, but the instructions differed from the perspective of, when I read the words to you, I want you to use the word in a sentence. So if the word were bat, you might think, I'm sure glad we didn't buy the house that had the bats. If the word is hall, it might be, I'm glad we did buy the house that has the big long hall. And so later on, when the participants have been distracted with other activities, no opportunity to practice the words, and they are then tested, what you see in front of you are the results of how many words they were able to remember or recognize from a larger list after what I think was maybe a 40-minute delay. And as you can see, those who processed the words just focusing on the first letter were able to remember about 18%. Whereas the more detailed somebody went in the processing, so it's a little bit more detailed to come up with a rhyme, it's certainly a deeper level of processing to use the word in a sentence. You have to think of the word, what it means, dig up your old grammatical rules from grade 2 to put it in a sentence. That extra level of processing significantly contributed to much greater success, where they were able to correctly identify or remember above 80% of those words. So that one subtle change or direction in instructions, which led to participants, cognitively intact participants, processing on a slightly different level, created a significant impact on overall recall. So during our program, we don't necessarily focus on one kind of strategy over another. In fact, we bucket them into two big categories: internal strategies and external strategies, with the goal that finding the combinations that work best for each individual will really help people process information in a deeper way. It might be a more conscious way than it ever used to be, but by doing so, it's now available and accessible to them remember. So it's not about increasing capacity of what you might remember, it's about improving the way you're getting the information in. And the reason I have the external strategies highlighted there is because a big part of successful improvement actually comes from people making a greater effort to switch to using more external strategies than internal strategies. As an aging expert, first and foremost, I can assure you that it is inevitable as we get older, we are going to need to do this just as a result of normal brain-related changes with age. So the earlier you start to adopt successful external strategies and implement them into your day-to-day activities, probably you will make fewer mistakes, there'll be less frustration, and you'll see greater successes. And it's a challenging one because people believe that they need to do things inside their head because they believe that's the best brain exercise for them, where there is many other ways to get good brain exercise. And ultimately, I would suggest if making mistakes in certain areas is bothersome to you, then use the technique that's going to guarantee you don't make that mistake. Don't worry about whether you're doing it in your head or not. Most likely, using an external strategy is going to be better for you. Task management. So you may recall that there are three big chunks or components to maximizing cognitive capacity. The first one is focusing on memory and how we process information. The second one is a little bit more in the area of task management. So the goal of task management is to address a lot of these more executive function changes that are experienced by those living with cancer. And the goal is to reduce feelings of overwhelm. So there's a greater tendency to feel overwhelmed by complex tasks. So teaching a process to help simplify those so it's less overwhelming, and as a result, doing better with both large and small daily tasks. The process itself is really pushing and promoting a present-minded state as opposed to an absent-minded state. I can't tell you the number of people I've worked with who describe their fog as being in this absent-minded state, almost operating on autopilot, but as a result, because they're not present-minded when they're doing things, they're not necessarily remembering if they've done something. And then there's that fear of did I or did I not do it, with no concrete evidence that they have. And then the other big area that task management helps with is reducing susceptibility to distractions and interference. This most certainly in the executive domains is one area that we hear people talk about a lot. So a greater tendency, as I said earlier, to jump from task to task and get so easily distracted, but then not looping back to finish the thing that was started. So the way we help people with task management and establish or hopefully achieve all of these goals is by focusing on a 4-step process. So we spend a few sessions really teaching this process with a lot of real life examples and opportunity for discussion. And the 4-step process is it's really simple to adopt. It's just the concept of stopping, then you want to clarify, then you want to simplify, and then you monitor, which is a feedback loop. So stopping is the mechanism of just taking a minute to stop, take a deep breath, and clear your mind. We should do this regularly throughout our day, especially anytime we transition from one position to the next or one task to the next, and especially if we are feeling a little bit foggy. The first thing to do would be stop, take that deep breath, and clear your mind. So you're now in a present-minded state. You're now pulling your attention to the task at hand, and to really help pull your attention to whatever your current situation is, you clarify by asking yourself 1 or 2, maybe 3 simple questions, such as, where was I going? Or what was I doing? Or what is the priority here? And then depending on that particular question and that answer, you might find that the answer, the response is too complex. I'm leaving for the day and I have to do all these things. So then it's the deep breath and the process of simplifying. Let's just break down everything into a series of simple steps so that nothing seems overwhelming. The big picture might seem overwhelming, but each individual step is manageable. And as long as you've identified the steps and worked through them, you actually complete the big overwhelming thing. And then the monitor is just a reminder to go back to stop and clarify. Monitor where you're at in terms of what your objectives were, what you're trying to do, and constantly bring yourself back to that present-minded state as opposed to operating in a absent-minded state. And then finally, the third big area that we focus on to maximize cognitive capacity is psychological well-being. And psychological well-being refers to how an individual feels about themselves, others, and the environment around them. And it can include a whole host of different constructs such as happiness, self-efficacy, coping mechanisms, optimism, feelings of control. And it's really difficult to bucket all of these into one session or 2 sessions, because quite often people might seek support for any one of these and then be in therapy or receiving that support for quite some period of time. So what we do is we focus on psychological well-being in a bigger picture, and we focus on it so heavily because we really firmly believe that the ability to think your best doesn't just rely on good memory strategies and good task management. It's also very heavily dependent on how well we feel. In fact, research has shown quite conclusively that generally speaking, when people are compared to themselves over time periods, and when there's the opportunity to give them a bunch of cognitive measures like memory, language, multitasking, and give them psychological well-being measures like happiness, optimism, feelings of control, those who are thinking well tend to be feeling better about themselves. When people, those same people, if they're not thinking as well, they might not be feeling as good about themselves. And the problem with such a strong correlation is it's hard to really tell what contributes to what. Are people thinking well because they're feeling well? Or are we feeling well because we're thinking well? So in the absence of knowing which is the most important piece there, to truly maximize your cognitive capacity, it's important to take your psychological well-being into consideration and to do what you can to enhance feelings of happiness, self-efficacy, feelings of control, etc. And unfortunately, what can often happen, and what we do see with many of the groups that we work with, is sometimes psychological well-being can become a self-fulfilling prophecy and people start to negatively spiral downhill. So I've got 2 examples using those constructs that were on the previous slide. And these 2 different examples are showing a different psychological well-being at the outset. So the first one might be feelings of loss of control. Absolutely. With a cancer diagnosis and treatment, there might be lots of feelings of control about many aspects of your life. And what happens is oftentimes people will bucket that into one big, I've lost control over everything. So that feeling of loss of control might lead to feeling that you can't do the things that you used to the way you used to, and that might result in a reduction in activities, a pulling away from doing the things that bring you joy. And with that can sometimes come an avoidance of things that are more challenging. So instead of being solution seeking when facing a challenge, there is more of a tendency to avoid the particular challenge. And that can lead to pessimism, and that can lead to depression and anxiety. And what we know about depression and anxiety is that can contribute to feelings of loss of control and cognitive changes like memory and language and multitasking. Whereas on the flip side, if we can help people to change their mindset, and I'm not suggesting for a minute this is easy, but some of the work that we do hopefully does help to create this change. So what we're trying to do is trying to reverse that trend. So if we can start off with, okay, I'm not in control of everything. I'm not in control of a whole lot, but there are some things that I'm in control of. I can be in control of how my brain functions. I can't control the changes I'm experiencing as a result of cancer or my treatments, but I can control how it's going to affect me. So I am capable and able to learn techniques and strategies and enhance the use of my external strategies and possibly layer more and more pavement on those particular highway systems. So I can feel like I'm more independent. I can make choices about where I want and need support and where I'm feeling like I'm independent. And as a result, I'm more likely to be solutions oriented, feel optimistic, and that level of optimism can certainly help to clear some fog and create a sense of mental clarity, which then demonstrates itself in feelings of greater control and improved memory, language, multitasking, etc. So just to quickly summarize, there's no doubt in my mind that the condition cancer-related brain fog exists. If you are meeting with healthcare professionals who are suggesting that's not the case, don't let that deter you or upset you. They just don't understand the length to which these conditions can impact somebody's life. The symptoms most certainly will vary from person to person, but the most common domains affected are memory and executive functions. We know that chemotherapy is not the only cause, and we also know that there currently are no medications available to specifically address cancer-related brain fog. But on the positive side, we do know that the brain does have the capacity to grow. It can recover, it can develop new connections, it can repair existing connections between brain regions, so we can compensate for areas where there's been weakness or damage. And that really one of the best ways to do that at this point in time is through neurocognitive rehabilitation and programs that are really helping you to become more self-aware of the challenges you're facing, the areas of the brain that might be affected by that, and then what's bothersome to you, and therefore the solutions, what solutions are available to you to enhance your own thinking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather, for such an insightful discussion on brain fog and for sharing your knowledge with our Wellspring community. So if you'd like to learn more about brain fog, Wellspring offers an 8-week brain program designed by none other than Dr. Heather Palmer herself. And this is an educational program that teaches methods to address and improve cognitive functioning and gives participants the opportunity to connect with others who are experiencing similar difficulties and learn strategies that can be adapted to individual styles and daily needs. For more information on upcoming sessions, please reach out to your local center or visit us online at wellspring.ca on our Well on the Web webpage. Next, we'll be moving on to the Q&A segment of our session, and we'll try to answer as many of your questions as we can. So it looks like the first question we have goes back to one of the slides about the MRI study, Heather. So the question is, are there any studies that show what studies like this MRI study look like further down the road? I'm wondering if this is something that gets fixed naturally with time, or if this is something someone who has undergone cancer treatment will be stuck with forever and needs to build new pathways.
Wow, it's a great question. I'm not familiar with any fMRI studies with cancer survivors that are longitudinal in nature in terms of monitoring people over time. But I can speak to the same concepts in a different population, and that's with children who have attention deficit disorders or challenges such as those. And so there's a more comprehensive literature on putting exploring those children in an fMRI scanner like what you saw, giving them some tests and seeing how they're functioning, and then putting them through an 8, 10, or 12-week intentionally designed attention program to help improve their attention. And then in that research base, what they do is they look at, in real world situations, are they better at paying attention and less susceptible to a fallout that can come with attention deficit disorder from a learning and a comprehension perspective. But at the same time, so while they did see, yes, there are improvements by a program such as that, when they then went into those same participants and put them in the scanner a second time and redid those exact same tests, they did in fact see that the brain had recovered, that in fact new pathways were being developed, and that the dependence on cerebral blood flow for simpler tasks wasn't as heavy, so that there was significant improvements by putting people through a program that was intentionally focused to help improve how the brain functions.
Thank you so much for that. So it looks like our next question is, what is the best brain exercise you recommend? In other words, should I be doing crossword puzzles, Sudoku, computer programs like Luminosity? What do you suggest?
It's a very popular question, absolutely, and there's certainly a multi-billion-dollar industry that's geared around people wanting to do more for their brain, such as programs like Luminosity. Generally speaking, my philosophy is to encourage people to do things that are keeping them mentally engaged, but most importantly, that are meaningful and purposeful to them. So I can tell you quite confidently, if I was told I had to do crossword puzzles, my brain would get worse rather than better, because I do not like crossword puzzles. So I think it's important to figure out what is intellectual engagement for you and how can you maintain that by doing the things that you actually love and enjoy. So if that's Sudoku, if that's combined with socializing, playing bridge with friends, or physical activity, I think that would be fantastic. Generally speaking, when people ask me and pin me down to say, what's the one thing I can do that's probably best for my brain, I strongly believe in social engagement and social activity. So the reason I like that so much is because to engage in conversations with another person, you need to take in information and pay attention. You need to now process that information in a way that makes sense to you while digging up your own facts or comments. Just as you're about to spit out your response, somebody else might butt in with their comment. So now you're having to take their information in, reprocess your thoughts before you participate in the conversation. And to me, that is a really wonderful example of neuroplasticity and neural pathway systems. Information going back and forth and digging things up and being actively engaged in that process. With respect to the computer-generated programs like Luminosity, there are many, many out there, and I'm not in a position to recommend one over the other. Generally speaking, when I look at them as a group, I think that there are many wonderful advantages to them, and they can be interesting and fun and helpful. I think, though, across the board, where they tend to fail or haven't managed to address yet, is that link between doing that computer-generated task, maybe it's an attention task where you're focusing on words, and linking that back to someone's personal life. So by doing this task, how am I now remembering to take my keys with me? So I think there's opportunity there to do that on your own if you want to do a computer-generated task. Take a moment after you've done those exercises to reflect on how you're going to apply it to those changes you're experiencing in your real life that are bothersome to you.
That's great. Thank you so much. So it looks like we have time for one last question. And this question is, what do you do when family members refuse to acknowledge brain fog and tell you that it's not real?
I think you give them my phone number. I think I'm joking, but I'm not joking. I think it's really challenging. It certainly is, whether it's family members, friends, or even employers. It's definitely a challenging and a delicate topic. So for many, what the biggest challenge is the person who's experiencing the changes themselves don't necessarily understand them themselves, and so they don't necessarily have the language to describe what's going on. I think the next challenge is quite often we will see significant changes and improvement in the physical impact of cancer. So people's hair will grow back in, their energy might look a little bit better, they might have a little bit more color, more mobility. Physically, they're told they're good and good to go, whether it's going back to work or doing whatever. But what we see the lag in is in the cognitive perspective. So I think it's very hard for the outside world to say, well, you look fine, and then for you not to necessarily have the language or it not be publicly enough public awareness that just because we look fine doesn't mean we feel and think fine. I certainly think that a lot of the work that's being done in terms of mental health and opening up discussion around that is certainly going to help people who have cancer-related brain fog, because we're starting to break down those stigmas and barriers that looking good means feeling good. People can look very good and not feel great. So I think it's important to have those open and honest conversations with your family members, and certainly share with them that cancer-related brain fog is a real condition. You've participated in a seminar on this. There are programs on it. So it's something that together as a family or a friend group or as employers, we want to work together to figure out what specifically are the challenges, how is it affecting me, how is it impacting us, and how are we going to work together on this.
Thank you so much, Heather. So it looks like that's all the questions we have time for today, and that about wraps up today's webinar. I definitely know everyone who participated in this session will definitely have many takeaways that they learned from all the strategies that you mentioned and just going over the symptoms and everything brain fog related. So thank you once again, Heather, for an amazing talk, and to everyone who was able to join this Be Well talk today. And we hope you'll tune in next time for another great Be Well Wednesday session. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today.